Aaron Swartz was something of a computer prodigy. When he was around 12, he helped create something called RSS, which was a way of keeping track of changes on blogs. He helped create a system for marking up those blogs called Markdown, which was used across a number of different blogging platforms and other social media systems. He drew data out of the Library of Congress to create this open archive version of the Open Library. He was one of the people who participated in creating something called Creative Commons, which allowed people to make creative reuse of something that someone else had produced. Did a bunch of stuff. He was one of the people that have ended up becoming, through a merger, one of the founding members in some ways of Reddit. So he had his hands in lots of things, and especially as he got a bit older, he became more and more involved in online activism and civil rights. And one of the things he did, and there's still some open question as to whether he should have been doing this or not, but he felt that much of the academic material that was available online and kept behind paywalls should have been free for other people to see and use. And in particular, there's a database which you can access if you're a university student called JSTOR, which holds articles that go back more than a century. Many of these are no longer in copyright, but in order to access them, you have to use JSTOR, and therefore you have to get access to the system that universities pay JSTOR to maintain. In 2010 and then into 2011, he had created a system at MIT that would slowly extract, or relatively slowly extract, hundreds of thousands of articles, with the assumption that eventually he would distribute these freely. There's a system right now that allows for people to exchange these free articles so that they can have access to the literature that's behind paywalls. But at the time, it was very difficult if you were in a third world nation or you were not in a university to get access to this scientific literature. And so although he never got to this point, the assumption was that he was going to use this collection of data to make it public, at least the stuff that was not copyrighted, and maybe even the stuff that was copyrighted, to make it publicly available so people could access it. He did this by, he was a visiting scholar at Harvard at the time, and also had permission to visit at MIT, and he'd found a closet and he put a server, a small computer in the closet, and kind of used that to slowly pull down hundreds of thousands of these files. When JSTOR figured this out and went to MIT and they figured out it was him, they went after him, and federal authorities had been going after him for other things before, but in this they saw a great opportunity to take down Aaron Swartz, and so they charged him with 13 counts. Had he been convicted, he would have owed over $1 million in restitution. He would have had to spend 50 years in prison. They offered him a plea bargain where he would only have to spend 6 months in federal prison. He had rejected that, and then soon after that he hanged himself. In some ways, I think that he is what we think of when we now think of the hacker. Certainly, he's one part of it, right? The kind of white hat hacker for most people, although many people still see him as a traditional pirate, someone out there getting stuff to be stealing stuff that was under copyright. But many people do see him as a much more white hat, liberator of knowledge than they do as a black hat pirate stealing copyrighted materials. So at least one part of what we can think of as the prototypical hacker is represented by Aaron Swartz. I'm sure there's the other side, which is the one that we see, the traditional photo on the TV or in the newspaper of this, backlit, shadowed person typing late at night trying to steal something from you. That's probably the other side of the hacker view. Why is the computer, and in this case someone who can use the computer well, why is that tied to the idea of political or social power? Well, it makes some sense. I mean, if you think about it, what the military now calls, or has called in the recent past, C3I, that is command, control, communication, and intelligence, or information in the British case, depending on where you're hearing it. So C3I, it's the idea that computer networks now represent a way of commanding and coordinating action in the real world. So even if, in the past we might have thought of someone that was online hacking, well, the worst they can do is find out some information, right? But now, if you control the network, if you had the ability to get access to any computer system in the world, you really would have control over all the money in the world, all the energy in the world, most of the machinery in the world. So you'd have a fairly extensive control over what goes on mechanically and also socially in our world. Going back all the way to the 1950s, a guy named Karl Deutsch talked about the nerves of government. And here he was talking about communication networks before the internet and before computing was combined with communication. But still, there was this idea that communication ended up being the kind of the lifeblood, because, although there were the muscles of government, the things that could, and, the military might, the actual things that could change things in the physical world, none of that happened without these nerves of government. And now computer networks make up that nervous system. And to the degree that you can access that nervous system, you can control not only governmental functions, but also business functions and as we're seeing now, especially with things like Cambridge Analytica, literally we can change people's minds by accessing large amounts of data and then by shifting or changing what people see when they go online and look. So the question then becomes, who gets to wield this immense power, this immense kind of concentration of control? And traditionally, one of the people we've thought of in that role has been kind of the engineer or the computer engineer or the programmer, right? Because of that, it was until the 1970s or so, and even today, but the main thrust here was this idea that the computer was the tool of the man. Certainly, when the computer was this room full of machines that were kept, in a white room, cooled and separated from the rest of the world, because of the concentration of capital, of money it took to get access to a computer like that, it was generally very large businesses or national governments who could afford to buy a computer. And so it was very closely tied to those who had a great deal of power already. And the use of the computer in that case was often to keep massive records on large numbers of people. In fact, the first use of computing that moved outside of governmental and military uses and into business uses was often by the insurance industry, because they also had to keep massive records on large numbers of people, dossiers. So in that case, it makes sense that it would feel like it was something that was the tool of the very powerful, of those who already had power, kind of the man, right? This also kind of extended into when we see it used by NASA and by other organizations that are kind of a technocratic view of government. Those who feel like they are in control because they have the means of control. And so it got tied very closely to that. We can often think of how we imagine various interactions and roles in society by how they're represented in media, and particularly in pop culture and mass media. So, this vision of the computer or the machine goes all the way back to early film, and especially films like Metropolis, some other films as well. But the kind of the key vision we have of it might be something like Metropolis. And so in this case, it's a robot who is created in order to control the working class and get them to do the bidding of the upper classes. And so maybe that's kind of the view we have of it. But that view of computers as being the legerdemain, the area in which the people of power work, continues on to today to a certain extent. At the same time, especially during the 1970s, we had a shift in some of the pop cultural ideals and also some of the ground use of computing. So what happened in the 1970s? Well, by the end of the 1970s, these room-sized computers were becoming desktop-sized computers. And so hobbyists, people in their garage, this is kind of that myth of Apple being created in the garage, and all of the homebrew computing club in the Silicon Valley, all of these kinds of things that could be started by not large governmental organizations and room-sized computers, but something much smaller. In fact, at the very beginning of the 1970s, a guy named Stuart Brand, who would later become pretty central to what we kind of call the Silicon Valley ideology now. Someone who participated in creating something called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was kind of central to the culture of Northern California at the time, sort of a hippie and communist, the move to the back to the land and creating small communes. That was the Whole Earth Catalog served that. And he was writing for the Rolling Stone, and he wrote an article about what he called he was looking at people especially at UC Berkeley, graduate students who were creating one of the first video games, a game called Space War. And the way they were doing it is they were sneaking in at night. Well, at least this is the way Stuart Brand had it. They were sneaking in at night and using these very powerful computers, PDP-9s, which were not, by now we certainly wouldn't think of them as such, but at the time they were very expensive machines to play video games, to create and play video games. And so he saw these guys as kind of the cutting edge of what was happening in computing. And he really foresaw what we would see through the 1970s, this move towards maybe this hippification of computing power, this idea that it could be used not just by governments and large businesses, but by individuals and small groups of people to be used as a revolutionary device, to be used to make changes in society. In 1974, a guy named Ted Nelson, who's one of the many people who kind of claim to have thought of the idea of the World Wide Web, but that's kind of an aside. But he wrote a small, well, I guess it's a book, but it's also kind of a zine. It was published by photocopying and distributing, and it was bound, and it was a weird kind of design for a book. If you find it now, the original edition of it, it's worth quite a bit of money. But in 1974, he published this book called Computer Lib, in which he argued that people that were not traditionally engineers should learn how to program, and that because the computer could be used as a way of simulation and a way of imagining, it was a technology that could be used for revolutionary purposes, a technology that could be used to create a more just society. And so, this idea, and it's a whole set of ideals that are built up around it. As I said, it got tied into some of the movement towards anarchy and kind of anarchistic movements around communes and back to the land movements and homesteading, and a lot of these pieces kind of built into what became the center of innovation in Silicon Valley. And so, you think of something like Apple, where, the 1980, they had a famous commercial in 1984 that was literally kind of setting them up as the force that would work against the vision of this oppressive state, right? And so they very much embraced that. It seems a little strange now, since Apple is kind of that 800-pound gorilla, that it is that large company that is restrictive in its own ways. But at the time, it really embraced this ideal of kind of fighting back against the machines of the oppressor.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Really, even today, one of the best ways of kind of getting a feel for what this culture looks like is how they embrace Burning Man. So even though people are very wealthy in San Francisco right now who are working in social media, and if you wanted any indication of the power of computing, you can look at kind of the move from the land barons of the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s to the oil barons of the early 1900s and into 2000. where we have this shift. And now if you look at the wealthiest people in the world, many of them are tied in some way to computing. And so, if you wanted to track where the power is, one of the ways to do that is to track where the money is. Aside from that, many of these people who are quite wealthy go out into the middle of the desert to create this temporary autonomous zone at Burning Man, where they engage in what their ideal view of what society should be in some ways is, without money, where people can engage creatively, without individual restrictions, where people embrace difference. So it's you get a little bit of the ideology of one side of that. So we have both at the same time. We have, very powerful interests who still use computing in order to enforce that power. Certainly when we look at things like the use of it by national governments, today it's being used to try to control populations and understand how to change their opinion. That's always been the case going back for the length of how computers have been used socially. And then from the 1970s on, kind of as a parallel track, we have this other vision. It's represented not by Metropolis or that sort of thing, but kind of by the Matrix, this idea of the revolutionary hacker who can take over from the computers that are oppressing us, or Mr. Robot, or even someone like if you've seen the film Brazil, Harry Tuttle, who's this guy who understands the infrastructure of the city and can use it in order to undermine it. And so this is actually a trope, this idea of the last DJ or the almighty janitor, this person who is technologically capable and can use those tools to undermine the systems of control in society. But particularly that idea of the hacker, if not the hacker as kind of the superhero. I mean, actually, if you think about it, there aren't very many hacker superheroes, but almost all of the superheroes out there have someone backing them up. I guess Iron Man is kind of a hacker superhero, an engineer superhero. Maybe Batman is to a certain extent. At least he owns a lab with people working for him. But this idea of being able to change things requires a very powerful set of tools, and those tools are often computing. So, in some ways, this is very much an American view of hacking. We don't have the sort of patriotic hacker, which is pretty common in places like Russia and China, where many of the people who are hackers there are hacking for the state, either paid by the state, or are simply very patriotic and are attacking other countries because of that patriotism. We don't have quite the same tradition of that here, in part because the government hasn't fostered it in the same way they have in Russia and China and in several other places, Israel and other places as well. So we don't have that same tie as, when we think about the computer as a powerful system, we think of it mostly in a technocratic way, that there are engineers, people who work for the government who use computing to kind of reach the government's ends. But we don't think of it in the same way as kind of hackers who go out there and break into computers in other states, and they do in some other places. Here, we think of the hacker kind of as the modern gunslinger, the person who comes into town and has a tool that they can use to change society, often in chaotic or anarchistic ways, that is undermining existing systems of control, but they are able to kind of go in and make that change because they have, it is the modern gun. They have control over the ability to change systems of power by using the computer. Does that mean that everybody who wants to have social power should learn how to program? I'm resistant in saying that you should become a programmer if you want to change society. I think there's other ways to do that. But it is hard to get away from the idea that if you can't afford to buy your own gunslingers, you probably need to become one. That there are certain levers of control in society that are only going to be open to those people who have the ability to manipulate information and computing systems.